Hi guys, in this module I talk about turning speed and move count, the two metrics which determine the speed of any solve. So this video will serve as an introduction to this relatively short module, but I'll also detail the main concepts that I'm trying to get across in the module, and there won't be a summary video. This module won't teach you any specific solving techniques, but rather it's here to serve as a general overview for more advanced cubers about the fundamental kind of determinants of your solve speed. I like to think about solve speed in terms of two metrics, and it's very easy to get caught up in, hundreds of algorithms, fancy finger tricks, multi-slotting, and not kind of take a step back and think about whether what you're doing will actually help your solves, or rather whether there are different things that you can practice that might be more valuable and have a greater impact on reducing your solve times. At its very core, the speed at which you solve a Rubik's Cube is a direct outcome of two factors. So firstly, the number of moves it takes you to solve the cube, which is your move count, and secondly, your turns per second. So how many turns are you doing every second throughout your solve? The time it takes you to solve the cube will be the number of moves that you use divided by your turning speed. And this isn't hand waving or generalization, this is just maths. If it takes you 70 moves to solve the cube and you do that at an average turn speed of 5 moves per second, then your solve will be 14 seconds. So looking at this simple 2x2 matrix where we've got some sample numbers for turning speed on the vertical axis and move count on the horizontal axis, we can see the magnitude of the effect that comes about when we actually change these numbers and the exact solve times that you'll get with these corresponding numbers. So for example, if we can have our solution at 60 moves and turn at a speed of 6 turns per second, then we have a 10-second solve. Everything you do in practice will be aimed at ultimately improving one of these two factors, or potentially both of them at the same time. Either you'll be directly or indirectly working on your move count and efficiency, or you'll be working on the speed at which you execute those moves. In the following videos in this module, I look at each component and talk about the factors which influence it. So if we assume that most people who've learnt the CFOP method and have done practice to make it more efficient and know full OLL and PLL can solve the cube in around 70 moves or less on average, then the solutions of the guys who are super fast aren't orders of magnitudes more efficient than the guys who are just sub 15. In fact, I've even seen examples where someone who averages around 15 seconds actually has better solutions than someone else who averages around 10 seconds. So it seems reasonable that once you're pretty comfortable with your techniques and solutions, and that with the assumption that the top speed cubers aren't necessarily that much more efficient than guys who are just 15-20 seconds, it might be a bit more prudent to actually focus on your turning speed, as that might be more of a differentiator. However, this obviously doesn't mean that you should go ahead and start turning as fast as possible just because your move count is good. The dynamics and trade-offs between your turns per second and your move count mean that you can have two solves which are 60 moves each, but one of them can be a lot better or easier to execute than the other, just depending on the amount of regrips, the amount of rotations, and how easy the finger tricks are. So there's a lot more in a solution to actually analyze than simply move count, but that's where it gets a little bit more subjective. And you can have, for example, solutions that are 55 moves long but horrible to execute versus a solution which is 65 moves long and it's much easier to execute. And even though it's a longer solution, you can execute it faster and actually have a faster solve overall because your turns per second increase is proportionately greater. So for reference, my average move count is around 60 moves and my average turning speed is around 9 turns per second. In the following videos in this module, I'll discuss move count and turning speed in a little bit more depth, and then I'll talk about some of the trade-offs between those two factors.